So I thought we would kick off with a starter while we just make sure that everybody's arrived, and it will give us a chance to see if the Q&A function is working too. So access the Q&A function now if you fancy joining me on this starter, and pop any answers in there. And so the question is, do these words mean anything to you? I'll give you a minute or two to write ideas down. Don't look anything up, because our students may not have that luxury. So those words at the top, plateau, I don't even know how to pronounce them, in fact, if I'm honest. So I know how to say plateau. The rest is kind of up to you. And for those like me who don't have a clue what those words mean, I mean, I know what the answer is, then consider James Murphy's words from that blog reference there that he wrote in 2014, in which he said, to be unable to read is to be locked out, to grasp the edges of conversation, to be without the knowledge of one's companions. It is to be terrified of failure and haunted by its presence. It is humiliation and frustration, and it builds into anger or despair. And that sensation that Murphy describes is something that the quarter of our secondary pupils who aren't working at age-related expectations could be feeling every day. But beyond that, if we consider that each of our subject disciplines introduces its own unique language, if we don't teach disciplinary literacy, which is what this session is about, if we don't teach that explicitly, then another big proportion of our learners will experience the same despair, which is what you may be feeling right now looking at those words. So they're all geographical terms related to landform. Now, I'm a competent and regular reader. I love the great outdoors, but even I'm lost by some of this vocabulary. If I'd read a paragraph that included them, then I would have struggled to fully understand that paragraph. And our students may feel like this in every lesson that we teach them when they're met with this disciplinary vocabulary, which is why this is an important part, which is why it's an important conversation. Full stop. Oh, there we go. There's the answer. I didn't realize there was another bit there. And so there's a little question there. Which terminology in your own subject would likely stump anyone not already immersed in it? So if you're not a geographer, what would stump people in your own subject? Okay, so let's do a formal start. So welcome to this Twinkl TeachMeet on disciplinary literacy. It's good to have you all here. My name is Sam Deno, and I am the National Education Lead for Secondary English here at Twinkl. But actually, maybe that's a bit of a red herring, because actually I'm making the case that all secondary educators should take responsibility for literacy in secondary school. So the fact that I'm an English teacher and an English specialist is, in one sense, neither here nor there for this session. What I wanted to mention here is that just before I kind of go into the next bit, at Twinkl we're looking to develop a more expansive Key Stage 3 reading intervention program, and we're seeking schools to work with as we begin to put together a package. If you're interested in getting involved and being on the vanguard of some exciting product and professional development opportunities, then you can register your interest on the feedback form that Casey will send to you at the end of this event. So that's just a little heads up. But on with the show. So Shanahan and Shanahan talk about these three distinct types of literacies. They talk about basic literacy, content area literacy or content literacy, and disciplinary literacy. And today's session is in the title is disciplinary literacy, but really it's difficult to think about one of those areas without thinking about them all. So we'll be touching on each of these areas and considering where responsibility lies within an educational setting and what some good starting points might be. And I suppose it's important to stress that actually that there are no easy answers or solutions. And as with much of education, decisions that a teacher, a home educator, a tutor, a department, a school make around how to address literacy, those decisions have to be weighed up with what trade-offs you're willing to make. And I'll refer to that again. So this series has been all about reading. So and when I say this series, this is actually the fourth of a group of sessions that we've done on Key Stage 3 reading. They've all been standalone. So if you've not been to any of the previous three, that's absolutely fine. You don't need that information, but those other three are available on the Twinkl website. So we are then leaning towards, even though this is disciplinary literacy, we're leaning towards reading specifically, although we could easily be having a similar conversation around writing or indeed oracy too. So if we have a look at this table, then when we talk about basic literacy there on the top row, we're talking about those foundational skills of reading. And in the English school system, that will look something like the journey in the early years from speaking to phonics and then decoding, fluency, comprehension. And we make an assumption that all of our children should have reached a competent level of reading by the time they reach the age of 11. And obviously we measure that via the Key Stage 2 national tests. Most children will have developed enough in their basic literacy skills that they'll be demonstrating versatility of literacy across the different primary subjects. So, for example, they'll be able to use maths vocabulary in maths or history vocabulary in history. And this is where we can begin to talk about content literacy. Content literacy is a way of thinking about teaching tools and strategies that will help us with generic reading skills across all of the subjects, or many of the subjects. And we could think about things like predicting, summarizing, questioning, making inferences. These skills can be used across the curriculum, and we'll go into this in more detail later. So when you're in a primary school and you have the same teacher for the majority of your subjects, this isn't too much of a reach. The same strategies and tools are used fluidly across those curriculum areas because they're all being delivered by the same person. The sticking point arrives when pupils hit year 7. So now, instead of having one teacher with one approach to reading across subjects, they're going to have many teachers with many approaches. So from that perspective, content literacy becomes harder to deliver in terms of consistency, because who dictates what the reading approach should be? And it only becomes more complex for our pupils because subjects begin to become highly specialized, and we have to start to think about disciplinary literacy. And that's where not only is the content different from subject to subject, but the way we talk about the content, the way that we read and write about it may be entirely distinct from subject to subject. Look at Elizabeth Mohay's quote there. Subject-specific literacy isn't just what we learn, it's how we learn. She talks about it produces, constructs knowledge. An example that I find useful here then, so with my English background, is the way, so in English, we're obsessed with context and the purpose of the writer. And it's because it's part of the exam specification. That's why we're obsessed with context and purpose. And similarly, in history, we're interested in who the author of the source is, what their motivations are, what their biases might be. However, in science and in maths, for the most part, certainly in secondary school, who the author is has little bearing on the text. It's much more important to understand the concept and to be able to apply the concept. So the way that we think about words as we read them changes from lesson to lesson. The Education Endowment Foundation helpfully provide a visual metaphor for these literacies, which I've borrowed from here. It's a tree metaphor. As we've said, in a learner's early school years, they hopefully get to grips with the basics of reading, and these are the roots of this tree. So this is basic literacy, and the aim is to learn to read, and it acts as the foundation for everything else that will follow. Without this in place, then the other concepts are obviously going to be tricky. And then the trunk of the tree there represents learners that are developing their reading fluency and comprehension and growing into competent readers. Typically, these are our Key Stage 2 students, and they're going to be working with a combination of basic literacy as their reading skills become more fully formed, and content literacy as they become more versatile with how they read across a range of texts and ideas. From Key Stage 3, that trunk begins growing in different directions. There's no longer one approach to reading and literacy. And so, as you can see on those examples, pupils need to reason like mathematicians, or critique like historians, or investigate like scientists, or survey like geographers. And of course, there's always going to be crossover between these different disciplines, but within each discipline, there are unique characteristics. We can think of that tree metaphor again. Unfortunately, I've not got a graphic of a tree on this slide, but we can think of it again when we consider the concept of tiered vocabulary, which you may well be familiar with. So tier 1 vocabulary is what is generally taught or absorbed in the early years and in Key Stage 1. So that could be seen as, go back to a tree, it could be seen as the roots in that metaphor. Tier 2 describes more complex academic vocabulary that usually has to be taught more explicitly. And engaging with that is a hallmark of reading competence. So that could be seen as the trunk in the tree metaphor. And then tier 3 concerns itself with low frequency subject specific vocabulary, and that constitutes the branching off into specialist areas. Of course, reading isn't all about vocabulary, but you can see how the progressive specialization of literacy is reflected through this movement. And I haven't actually got a slide for this, but I just wanted to bring in a little bit of basic cognitive load theory to try and place all of these ideas alongside that. So when it comes to basic reading, basic literacy, in order for a child to develop their language comprehension skills more rapidly, they need to become fluent in decoding words that are unfamiliar to them. And the more fluent they are, the less cognitive effort they need to devote to breaking down words and sound, and the more they can focus on the meaning of those words. Think about content literacy. By the time the pupils arrive in year 7, they should ideally have developed automaticity in word recognition, so that this process is cognitively offloaded, allowing them to concentrate on understanding curriculum content. We often talk about that step up from year 6 into year 7. It changes from learning to read to reading to learn. In contrast, research shows then that when reading fluency is weak or effortful, comprehension is significantly compromised, particularly as texts become more complex. So our pupils are banging their heads against decoding and unable to engage with that complex meaning behind some of the ideas and concepts that we present with. So this has application if we're thinking about basic literacy, because we're talking about learning to read, but it also has relevance when we're talking about disciplinary literacy, where we're wanting pupils to be able to recognize those tier 3 vocabulary words quickly and easily, so that they can just get on with learning what's in the lesson. Now let's apply this knowledge of different types of literacy to a secondary setting. So in terms of basic literacy, as I alluded to earlier, around a quarter of our year 7 students are reading below their age-related expectations, and in fact it's about a third when it comes to disadvantaged pupils. But in terms of that quarter, that's a quarter of the cohort who could do with some intervention work around basic literacy. So whose responsibility is that? If you're in a school setting, which some of you will be, some of you won't be, hopefully you'll have a literacy lead who'll have an overall plan for how reading and writing interventions are delivered, and you might even be one yourself. If a literacy lead is part of the leadership team, then that's a big advantage, because that means there can be a top-down program that pushes ideas to all departments. But ultimately, if there's no overarching strategy, it comes down to individual educators to support those struggling readers. And like I've said already, that's not just the job of the English department or of you as an English educator, because English teachers have their own curriculum to deliver. If a learner is unable to read competently, then they're unable to access any subject area effectively. So we all have responsibility. Now, actually, this session is not about this. So we've run 3 sessions that consider sort of addressing basic literacy needs in Key Stage 3 already. So I'm not going to go into loads of detail here, but it's my opinion that all secondary teachers, secondary educators, should understand what a child has been taught at primary school and should be able to work with the principles that pupils have been drilled with in those primary phases. And how do we do that? Well, the 2023 reading framework, which is linked there on the slide, is a perfect place to go for starting with that. It's a big old document, but I found it incredibly useful to me for getting to grips with how reading skills are developed. How else? Well, you could go back and watch the other videos that we've recorded as well. As part of the curriculum reforms for 2028, the government have also pledged to produce a secondary specific reading, writing and oracy framework, which will offer further tools that are bespoke to secondary settings. Obviously, now that 2023 one, it sort of it mainly focuses primary schools, but all of the information in there is generally pretty helpful to secondary teachers as well. Okay, in terms of content literacy, as discussed, this is about developing tools and strategies that pupils can use to read across many or all subjects in the curriculum. So the same question applies here. In a secondary setting, who would it make the most sense to take responsibility for content literacy? Now, in many schools, there isn't a coordinated approach to content literacy across subjects. And again, my recommendation would be that a consistent approach is adopted, because otherwise we're asking pupils to completely change their strategy, their reading strategies, every time they enter a new classroom and they encounter a new teacher. Again, that's the job of a literacy lead, if you have one, if you're working in a school setting. If you're not working within a school classroom setting, though, the same advice applies. What consistent approaches would be useful to adopt across all subject areas? And you can be more consistent, can potentially be more consistent across all the areas if you consider the right tools for reading. And we're going to go through some of those in a minute. As for disciplinary literacy, that's probably fairly obvious that responsibility for how to read and write in a distinct way for a distinct subject area lies with the person or the department who teach that subject area, potentially again driven by leadership or by a literacy lead. The challenges around disciplinary literacy lie in the fact that our poor pupils are required to be incredibly dynamic as they move from lesson to lesson. They're effectively stepping into a new language or dialect every time the bell rings. So we need to be as explicit as possible about the expectations of language in the particular subject we're teaching them, and again, their classroom teacher or their tutor needs to be responsible for that. Also, we need to be quite forgiving if they don't immediately start talking like historians at the start of a history lesson, say, because who knows what they were doing before that. They might have been talking like a sports person or talking like a musician or whatever. But there are benefits to disciplinary literacy too, where young people have become resistant to learning to read and have struggled with some of the concepts of basic literacy. It may be because things like reading for pleasure hasn't landed with them, and they just think that the idea of reading is a slightly abstract construct, because why learn to read well if you're not interested in reading? So as subjects become more specialized, the need to read in order to access them becomes less abstract. A learner may not want to engage with reading for the sake of it, but they may want to engage with reading because they're interested in the periodic table, for example, and the specialized vocabulary that goes with that can unlock the door to a world of chemistry. So distinct subject disciplines provide context for literacy. So what I'd say is that actually pulling pupils out of lessons in order to provide them with focused reading interventions for basic literacy can be counterproductive too. And again, this is one of those difficult trade-offs where a school or an educator has to decide where the most value is offered. Okay, let's have a look at some generic content literacy strategies and some discipline specific strategies. This is, by the way, this is, I'm aware this is sort of fairly heavy stuff, and I've just gone through a load of sort of background theory, so hopefully there's some practical ideas here. I am going to go through nearly all of these and sort of talk through them, but it's difficult. Disciplinary literacy, content literacy, it is difficult, and I'm sort of certainly not advocating for saying, right, there are 9 items on the left hand side there, you need to be practicing all 9 of those items. If you're interested in engaging with this, then actually just pick 2 or 3 of these ideas. If you're doing those already, that's brilliant, or try and make them consistent across the subjects, or in the case of disciplinary, just think that through. So monitoring comprehension. So let me say these are taken from Lee and Spratley, as you can see there. That's I can't read the title because it's behind something. The challenges of reading in the disciplines, and that's it's available online, so you can find that online if you want to. In fact, they go into some really good subject by subject detail for science, history, literature, and maths if you've got a bit more time to read their paper. And one of the important points that they make is that comprehension is determined by many things. It's partly established via a recognition of words and grammatical structures, but it's also informed by prior knowledge of a topic, and we'll go into that a little bit in a minute. So that monitoring comprehension, we might well do this very, very naturally as part of our sort of formative assessment process, but consistently check in with pupils when you're reading a text. What are they understanding? What aren't they understanding? Pre-reading there, don't just launch in with a dense text about an unknown topic, because that potentially plays against both the learner's literacy levels and their prior knowledge. Some thought has to go into, and it usually does, go into sequencing and building up to more complex knowledge and reading structures. And so you might do this via a sequence of lessons, or you might invite pupils to independently read adjacent texts ahead of time. So in a sense, flip learning. Set goals, give pupils a clear purpose for reading. Why are they reading it? What are they trying to find out? What are they trying to understand? What should they be able to do by the end of the text? So a defined goal focuses attention and prevents passive reading, where pupils just it's just going in one ear and out the other. Think about what one already knows. So again, that's activating that relevant prior knowledge before reading, and that helps pupils to make connections between new information and what they already understand, and strengthens comprehension and retention. That's a sort of metacognition thing as well there. Asking questions. This is pupils asking questions. Encourage pupils to generate questions before, during, and after reading, and that keeps them actively engaged, and it means they sort of start to notice gaps in understanding. English teachers love starting with a well, this is actually for the next one. Yeah, make predictions. English teachers love starting with a novel by looking at the book cover and saying, what do you think is going to happen in this book based on cover? So ask pupils to anticipate what the text might say next based on a head, like I say, book, the cover, or headings, or based on the structure, based on their prior knowledge. because prediction encourages active reading again, and it gives pupils something to check as they go, which then you can see that test predictions against the text. So keep going back to their predictions and checking in with that. Rereading allows consolidation. Pupils will notice details they missed the first time, and it will potentially resolve misunderstandings. And then summary, or writing summaries of what has been written, summarize. Pupils identify and restate the key ideas of the text in their own words, and this supports comprehension by requiring them to distinguish between the main ideas of a text and not to worry too much about the supporting detail. And then you've got that list down there on the right hand side of disciplinary reading strategies, and as you can see, if you sort of scan through them, there's a lot of crossover there with generic reading strategies. I mean, actually, with the content literacy side of things, actually, I wouldn't worry too much about labels, but I would bear in mind that certain subjects, or all subjects, have unique literacy elements to them. So that building prior knowledge, explicitly teach the background knowledge that pupils need in order to make sense of the text. In disciplinary reading, comprehension often breaks down not because of decoding, but because pupils lack the necessary contextual or conceptual knowledge. And then specialized vocabulary, we've kind of touched upon that already, but teach those subject specific terms and phrases that carry meaning in the discipline. Many of those words are going to be tier 3, low frequency in everyday language, but they're essential for understanding the subject. Learn to deconstruct complex sentences. There's what we've not mentioned so far, and what's very important, is modeling. So modeling how to unpack long information dense sentences by identifying clauses, connectors, key ideas. And we have a big role to play there as educators in naturally just pausing over a sentence and making it clear to our pupils how we read that sentence, breaking it up, going through it, making it clear that sometimes it's a struggle for us as well. Use knowledge of text structures and genres to predict main and subordinate ideas. So these get quite technical. So that's teaching pupils how disciplinary texts are typically organized. So for example, in a science experiment, and I'm not a science teacher, but as I remember it from my own school years, you're talking about aim, method, hypothesis, results, conclusion. So that's how a science text is typically organized, and that is a science literacy factor. Or in English, we think a lot about text structures to create effect. Again, that's a disciplinary literacy thing. Recognizing structure helps pupils understand meaning more effectively, and it helps them to consider what's important and what's less important. That next one is about graphics on or within text. So show pupils how diagrams, graphs, tables, equations, how they relate directly to the written equation. And disciplinary reading often requires moving fluently between modes, so visual modes, written modes, rather than just treating those visuals as add-ons. These last three I'm kind of going to skim over because I think they're perhaps a little bit more typically A-level or degree level concerns. They're mostly about thinking about the validity of a text, but of course that does have resonance in certain subjects in our English secondaries. But pose discipline relevant questions, compare claims and propositions across texts, use norms for reasoning within the discipline. to evaluate claims. Okay, this grid of skills by Relia Cosset-Lent is really useful just for capturing key differences, and you can see that the questions that we pose and the language we use, it all falls under similar headings, in this case read, write, think, but it's massively varied in nuance according to the different subject areas. And we need to be aware of this as, we need to be aware of this as educators, but similarly, our pupils need to be aware of this too, not necessarily the technical level, but they need to be aware it's different across all these different disciplines. You will be sent a copy of these slides after the session. When you get them, I would suggest just spending some time scanning across this table, look at the differences across those disciplines. Do you deliberately communicate to your learners the literacy demands for the discipline area that you're teaching and how it differs from other areas? Okay, here is a practical way of gathering our thoughts. So on this pro forma, we're thinking about literacy in design and technology, and there's a blank one on the next slide. We've thought about how literacy is important to design and technology at the top there. In that top row, it's how it's important, and you can see that it focuses on literacy as being integral to the design process. So it's used as we identify need, as we carry out research, as we explain our process. And then there's a box that thinks about text types on the middle left hand side. What sort of reading materials and texts are students likely to come across in design and technology? And obviously this presentation has been focused on reading, but as I've already said, we could easily be talking about writing or even oracy in relation to disciplinary literacy. So there are a couple of boxes there that I've included about writing, typical writing demands, typical oracy demands. And then we consider specialized concepts and vocabulary, bottom left. Remember what Elizabeth Mohay said, disciplinary literacy isn't just about what you learn in a subject, it's the construct for how you learn as well. And finally, bottom right, we've considered strategies for how we present consider strategies for how you present literacy in design and technology. And some of those bullet points could be described as content literacy. They're really good, broad, generic tools that would work across the majority of subjects, but it's important to identify that they'll fit well into specific practice as shown here. And then that final one, that model sequencing and passive voice, is more a disciplinary literacy skill. It's got relevance in a number of subjects, but not all. So writing in the passive voice is a skill for talking about concepts and process particularly, and it's very important in D&T when you're thinking about things like product design and the communicating of technical information. So like I say, you'll receive a copy of this slideshow at the end of the event, and you'll find this blank version of the table on slide 11. If you haven't done anything like this already, then I'd strongly advise that you sit down with other members of your department, or sit down and think about this yourself and fill this in according to your subject discipline. If you're the literacy lead in a school, then it would offer value to sit down with each department and get them to begin thinking in these terms. And don't forget that it's just as important that your pupils understand that the way you think about literacy is different in different subjects. Of course, the information, again, is on this table is very technical. They don't need that level of technicality, but they do need to be aware that they should equip themselves differently for different subject areas. Ultimately, then, what am I advocating for? That across the secondary curriculum, we all take responsibility for basic literacy. If our pupils are unable to read fluently, then they'll be unable to access much of what we teach them. So we need to familiarize ourselves with the reading framework and get to grips with how we can pull learners up to their appropriate reading age, all of us. If nothing else, we need to understand at least how to support the reading interventions that our learners might be receiving. I'm also suggesting that we think carefully about our specific subject areas and what the literacy demands we make on our students are. And this will allow us to develop and build both generic and distinct literacy scaffolding to support all of our learners. That we talk to our students about literacies in the same way we should talk to them about a lot of their learning, such as metacognition, and we explain within each of our respective subjects what the literacy demands are and how they might differ to other subjects. That we're generous to our pupils about the expectations we place upon them as they move from one disciplinary language to another several times through a day of learning. And then the final thing that I want to say and sort of reiterate is that every pedagogical decision an educator makes has to involve trade-offs. And if we choose to teach one thing, then we have to sacrifice another thing. And we don't have infinite time in a day. So in your setting, whether that's in a school, at home, somewhere else, you'll need to decide where to place the emphasis. If you choose to have a whole school focus on basic literacy or on disciplinary literacy, then you might have to decide not to focus on numeracy and vice versa. And every setting is different, which is why it's almost impossible to offer definitive solutions. But hopefully, over the course of this 45 minutes, I've armed you with enough information here for you to go away and to start to think about individual practice and next steps. And that is about all I've got to say. Thanks for listening.